Prefer to listen on the go? Find the audio version of Katie Prentiss' Sunshine Soul wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Katie Prentiss, and this is Sunshine Soul. I remember flying out of Portland one gray morning. It had been raining for days. That kind of heavy, wet Pacific Northwest gray that just seeps into your bones. I had the window seat on the plane like always. And as we ascended, I watched the droplets race across the glass. The clouds outside were so thick, like walls. And for a moment, it felt like the sun just didn't even exist anymore. And then we broke through. Probably my favorite moment. The clouds fell away, and there it was, blue sky, bright light, the sun just sitting there like it had been the whole time. And it hit me in that moment. The sun is always shining, even when we can't see it. Here at Sunshine Soul, we hope, we heal, and we love despite the clouds. We remember that there's light ahead. Welcome to Sunshine Soul. Let's keep looking for the light together. All right, so we are going to talk about faith journey. We could say like religion journey, like exploration and Christianity journey for me. And I'm going to be honest, this episode has made me so squirmy inside. It has brought up all of those things that we just talked about, where it's like, what will they think? Response comes out, people are going to judge me. But I also know that like faith and like politics and money, these are topics that make people uncomfortable. One, because it is so personal, but two, because I think so often people we all want our own choices to be validated by other people's choices. So it feels so much better when someone mirrors my choice, my morals, my faith. It's like, oh, you too? Okay, great. We're both thinking the same thing now. I feel affirmed. I also, have experienced so many different things in my journey of faith, so many different types of denominations, etc. And I just want to say that, like, I support anyone's journey, anyone's exploration, curiosity, faith, and, just ask that same courtesy would be extended toward me. And I'm going to just move forward and share basically the chapters and seasons of my faith in this episode. And I just am going to invite Billie Eilish's motto of go ahead and judge me. Okay, let's go. Episode 5, Evolutions of Faith. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and we lived in Ohio at this time, and my experience in this church was that my mom would take us 3 kids every Sunday morning, and my dad would stay home and read the Sunday paper. It was just like the visuals were so clear. I can still see him in his robes, probably so happy to have some time alone at the house while all of us kids got dressed and got taken to church. Our church was called Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And I remember thinking it was pretty cool that our church had a Sunday topping in its name. And I thought that sounded delicious. I didn't understand anything more than that about it. But I want to share a specific memory from my experience at Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And it was from my first communion. I never felt more like a princess than during some of the Catholic traditions that I grew up in. My mom would often sew clothes for us, and we just got all the fancy things when it came to like Easter or one of the sacraments that we got to do. First communion was no different. I had patent leather shoes. I had knee-high white socks. I had the prettiest little white dress. I even got to get like a little white purse to match with little white gloves inside. We often got like a tiny little Bible, like New Testament version of the Bible included, little white hats. It was just so fancy. This was as close as I got to living a little pretty princess life. And I remember on that Sunday of First Communion, I don't remember much about the sacrament, but what I remember is after the service, they were posing all of the children that had gotten their First Communion. And I don't know if I was in the bathroom or what, but I was not in the group. And I heard everyone calling my name. So I was running to where the group photo was being taken, and I tripped and fell. And I got the bloodiest knee. So imagine this, all white dress, all white socks, everything so perfect, and then a really bloody knee. I was ready to cry. I was holding it in. I limped myself to the photo. I sat down in the middle, and then I sat down and I crossed my legs carefully so that I would be covering my bloody knee, and I put my hands on top of my knee. And I sat there and I smiled, even though I wanted to cry and the pain was real. And I just think, God, what a funny visual to have like a bloody knee and this fancy dress and like smiling even though you want to cry. It just feels like such a strong metaphor and picture for what religion can often feel like, what our experience of faith can feel like. I remember thinking during those years in the Catholic Church, some of the visuals that come to my mind is, the statues of Mary and just the gentle but strong femininity she represented. Our church was called Our Lady of Mount Carmel. My mom took me to church. I felt like there was this femininity, there was this awe, there was this holiness, this otherness, this reverence about it. But there was also there's so much imagery of, Jesus dead on the cross and bloody, and all of those things stood out to me as well. I remember the holy water, and I remember incense, just all the rituals that took place. And it felt meaningful. And I remember as a child thinking, yes, I believe in all of this. Of course, yes, feels good, feels right. And when can I dress up again? So by the time I was entering the 6th grade, our family moved to the South. And I don't know if you know, but Jesus is actually from the South. He's from southern states in America. Just kidding. But it does feel like that sometimes. Moving to the South as a Catholic family from Ohio was a different experience. We moved to a smaller town in Georgia. And some of my first experiences were a little jarring. My parents chose to send us to a small private Catholic school that was attached to our church. And the first day that I would go to the class, I was in the hallway with one of the teachers she wasn't actively a nun at that point in her life, but she was a retired nun, I guess. And when I met her, she asked me a question about, I can't even remember something about myself. And I said, yeah. And she said, excuse me? And I was so confused. I said, yeah. And she said, yes, ma'am. So snappy and so mean. I remember feeling terrified. And here I was in this Catholic school, and this religious authority yelled at me right off the gate because of a cultural difference. Like in Ohio, it would have been sassy and rude to say yes, ma'am to someone. That's the only way we said it. It would be like, yes, ma'am, And in the South, that's what everyone says. So it was interesting being thrown into that and immediately kind of questioning like, oh, here's this nun, but I feel really scared of her. I remember sitting in one of our Catholic services in Georgia, and the priest gave this talk about how to answer as a Catholic if someone asks you if you're saved. And I remember thinking, what? What do you mean? And it was at that moment that I discovered there were a lot of people out there that would say that we weren't Christians as Catholics. And I was so confused about that. Why does there need to be a separation? Why would somebody ask me if I'm saved? And then it kind of made me nervous. It made me feel like maybe we were outsiders, maybe we were others, maybe, questioning like, what does all of this faith stuff mean? The contrast between Catholicism and evangelical culture is really strong there. The nuns seemed angry. Evangelicals seemed so happy. I remember there was this girl in my high school that just seemed so kind and so sweet, and she smiled all the time. And I just thought, who is this girl? And like, what is her deal? And I remember talking to her, and she would talk so much about Jesus and the Bible. And I remember friends telling me that there was something called Christian music. And I was like, wait, what? and and just being exposed to this different kind of faith, it felt like I wanted to explore, and I didn't want to be on the outside, and I wanted to understand the differences and distinctions. Faith felt more, I was thinking about like faith to me felt like maybe there's more to this. Maybe people are happier if they go like a different way with their religion. And so at this point in my life, I'm thinking like faith felt more like a smile, y'all. Like it just felt like these happy people walking around. During this stage in high school, I started exploring things even more. I would go to church with my friends. So here I was, I'm in Catholic church every Sunday with my family. My dad starts attending church at this point in our life. And my dad was always like an incredibly hard worker, a really strong businessman our whole life. He always provided for us, and I'm so grateful. And at that point in his life, I'm sure it was more complex than this, but I remember him articulating that in the culture we were in, it was better for him to attend church, even for like his work relationships and stuff like that. And so it kind of touched a nerve with me, or made me come to a new realization that here, culturally in the South, it is important that you go to church. You will be accepted or rejected based on whether you attend, which was fascinating to me. So many of my friends in the South attended all different types of churches. I went with them. I went to Baptist church, Methodist church, Pentecostal church, Assemblies of God. I would go to youth groups on Wednesday, Sunday night services. I was just open and interested and curious in all of it. There were really cute youth group boys at the Wednesday night services. The pastor kid playing the drums was so cute up on the stage. I remember just thinking like, I was still so confused because in my mind, I had always believed in God and it felt like a yes to me. But there was something that people were saying I needed to have. There was something different that they said I needed to do, words I needed to say. And I wanted to belong. And I loved what I knew of my faith. So I was eager. I found myself responding all the time. It's funny to me to think about now, but it just shows a sincerity in my life where I'd go to a service and they'd have an altar call and they would say things like, if you've never been a Christian and you want to give your life to Jesus, like raise your hand. And I'd be like, well, that's not me. And then they'd say, if you just want more when you're with your relationship with God and you want to rededicate your life, raise your hand. I'd be like, okay, that's me. Let's do that. I think I rededicated my life like 5 or 6 times in one year. That year, I was like following this evangelical path. This path would say you have to have salvation in a very specific way. This path would question my baptism that I had as an infant and say I needed to be baptized. This path would say that you needed to pray in certain ways, read the Bible in certain ways, like attend church in certain ways. And, I was game. For me, at this point in my life, faith actually felt like friendship and belonging. There was like a lot of life behind it. During my high school years, I also got involved in an organization called Young Life, and I absolutely loved my time with that organization. Like faith became fun. Faith became more casual. Like we would sing songs together and like do silly skits together and then hear a little motivational talk. And these were where my friends were. It felt wholesome and good and nurturing and fun. And I was happy. I was understanding things about Christianity that I had never heard before. I was exploring who Jesus was on my own for the first time, not just through the church. And I like the autonomy of that. And I wanted to stay faithful and deepen my path in that way. After high school, I went to college and was trying to figure out where to explore faith and how to plug in. I remember looking for Young Life organizations in college and trying to think about how to volunteer as a leader there. I went to a small school in Northwest Georgia, and there was no Young Life in that town, or if there was, it was like too many hurdles to jump through as a young college student. But there was a new organization that was starting on my campus called Campus Outreach. And this organization is kind of a blend of Campus Crusade and maybe Navigators and different organizations like that, if anyone's familiar. There were some people that I knew that seemed like serious about their faith in the way that I wanted to be serious about my faith. And I got to be friends with them, and they invited me to meetings, and it seemed really good. It seemed like we're in this organization that takes their faith really seriously. They take, the disciplines of prayer and scripture and community and all of that very seriously. And so I wanted to plug in once again. I remember in that organization feeling like I was digging deeper. I was resonating with the ideology of the organization, but it felt really different from Young Life. And so there was a little conflict in me of like Young Life and my high school experience in evangelicalism was so much about friendship. It was about making friends, loving people. There was a lot of it felt real and vulnerable type of people in this organization. And then I got to Campus Outreach and it felt so intense. It felt like they would say things like, the only thing that really matters is things that last for eternity. And that's the souls of men and the word of God. And I started thinking like, okay, well, I guess that makes sense, because if there is eternal life, then like what we do here is such a small portion of like how we would really live forever. And so I would adapt these ideas and make decisions based on them. I still look back and think about, when people ask me, have you always acted? I'm like, no, but I almost auditioned for a play in college. I really, really wanted to. And I remember getting the information and then looking at how much time it would take for rehearsals. And I told myself no, because it didn't align with what had eternal value, quote unquote. It makes me sad now to look back on that and think about, wow, that's such a small way to think about our life and how we spend time, and even like our faith. That's such a small, confined faith. But that's what I was digging into in that time in my life. It felt like faith was a solvable equation. It felt like faith really came down to black and white answers. There were answers for everything. There were quotes and teachings and lessons, and they really, really pushed students to be involved in evangelism and discipleship. What that meant is they wanted us to win people over, to share our faith with people, to try to convert them to evangelical thinking. And they wanted discipleship, which what that meant was they organized the students on campus with like discipleship group leaders, and then a small group that they led and did Bible study and different things with. And wow, like it was a system that made sense to me. It was a system that I liked. It felt safe. It felt confined. It felt solvable. I felt really good about myself. I felt like I knew I had all the answers. I look back and I think, wow, I was very egotistical. I, judged people for a lot of things, like decisions that didn't feel as committed as things that I was living and experiencing and the truth I was ascribing to in this organization. I rose through the ranks of the way they established their organization. I look back and I think that is what made me feel good about myself. Like, I liked being a part of this. I, became a discipleship group leader. I got invited to leadership positions they would take trips and like do projects where a bunch of college students would come together and spend a summer in deeper training. And it sounds a little culty right now as I'm saying this out loud, and that's okay. I think that we all felt good about what we were doing. And the other thing as I think about is some of my best friends to this day came from these times in my life. And so even though we can shift and change in what we think and what we perceive, I think that life is so cool how there's still like so much beauty despite some of the choices that we make. The organization that I was in is really run primarily by 20-somethings. When you think about it, it really relies on students getting more students involved. And the leadership is basically recent graduates from college organizing these students and getting this organization to grow. There was pressure to quote unquote reproduce, to, to win people over and have this. There was such like an external judgment of whether people were able to do this or not, gather a small group or like influence people. Sometimes I'll talk to friends that were kind of on the peripheral of this organization. And I'm like, why did you not do it? Like, how did you know? Like, how did you know that it was like, okay to just do your life or travel to Europe or not try to rise through the leadership ranks of this? And we have a laugh about it now, but I think it's interesting to look back. Sometimes I look back and I think, I probably owe a lot of people apologies for this time in my life because of the pressure. We all felt this pressure. I have to try to be gentle with myself and understand what about me like needed that time and hope that they all can be gentle with themselves too and hopefully with me as well. But needless to say, faith in this time in my life was very black and white, and it was that there were answers for everything and there was confident answers for everything. The other thing that really was highlighted in this time in my life was just about male leadership, which is fascinating to look back on as well. There were I remember sitting in one meeting and they asked for volunteers to pass out papers to the group. And of course, I'm like, sure, whatever, I'll volunteer to pass out papers. And they had a talk with us later and told us as women to not volunteer for things like that because the men needed to lead and the men needed to rise up, and how men would just let women lead if they try to, and it weakens the men. Oh, wow. Like, let's unpack that for a moment, right? And this is a community. When I heard that, I felt that feels really weird. That feels uncomfortable, but also these are my friends and these are people I love. And so again, I said, okay, and like passively move through that. As time went on, I moved toward graduation of college. I was earning an English degree. I thought I might teach, but then I was so excited about everything that was happening with this organization that I was with. They actually asked me to come work for them. So instead of I finished my English degree, but I ended up not getting my teaching certificate because I thought, I can just go work for campus outreach. Now, the organization is when you come on staff with them, you actually raise all of your financial support for your paycheck. So it's a good deal for them, for sure. I graduated from college and immediately went to start raising support to go work on a campus. I was selected to go work at a very small school in a small town in Alabama. And I spent the next summer after graduation raising financial support. And I'm very thankful for all the people that stepped into my life to like support this young girl who thought she knew a whole heck of a lot in her life, thought she had the answers. I know that I've always, one through line that I've always had is that I've wanted to love people and I've wanted to love people well. And I hope that that really shone through, and that's why people like jumped on. But it was kind of amazing. I was able to raise my support pretty quickly and have the financial backing that I needed. And again, I'm going to work for this organization as the female staff leader. What that meant was that I was in charge of the girls, the women in our campus ministry only. There was another male leader that was the campus director. He was in charge of everybody, but because I was a female, I was just in charge of the women. Now, I raise all of my financial support for my salary, and it's interesting now to look back, like some of the men on staff couldn't raise their support. And I remember being asked by one of our campus directors, since I had an overage, which means I had a little more than my salary was going to be in my account, which would be perfect to save for the following year in case people dropped off. Instead of that, I was asked, would I donate my overage to one of the male staff that couldn't raise his support? And of course, I said yes. And I think again, wow, that's so interesting, right? Like we love the labor of women, but we don't really want to give them authority or positions of responsibility. I also remember many times realizing my voice didn't have similar value to the men that I was working with. I would be in staff meetings and I would question a decision and say, I don't feel like that's right. I think that the other way to go is the right way to go. And my male staff partner would go, well, I don't know about that. And then he'd ask another man, what do you think? And if that man agreed with me, then he'd go, oh, okay. So it was things like that being reinforced of playing small felt right. It was what I was supposed to do. I was a woman, like we were taught like all the lines of, the Adam and Eve story was about Eve wanting to take control and take power and how she needed to like be tamed and tampered down. And I was naive. I was young. I was gullible. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be approved of. And so I said yes. I didn't understand. I grew up in a home that like my dad was strong and worked hard, and my mom was submissive and gentle and never worked. And it's like my experience, my understanding, everything was lining up. But I knew deeper down, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel comfortable. I remember feeling like working for them, that there was a lot of the job that I loved, which was like going and talking to girls on campus and giving them love, giving them support, listening to their stories, having them over. I loved that stuff. But I also remember hating like the way I felt forced to have conversations, to pressure students into commitments, to get people to come to the projects in the summer and the trips that they were being invited on. It didn't feel good. It felt wrong. It felt like I was seeing people's mental health decline in some capacity in our organization. I was seeing some fallout. I was seeing people get burned by the way the organization worked. And again, I kind of thought, well, I could be in this organization and still be like an outlier who supports and loves and like kind of circumvents these things. But I know that I didn't do that well. I know that I burned people myself. And that is something I have to live with. I have to think about these people and wonder, are they okay? This is actually making me want to reach out to people right now. So I have some work to do still on this, even this many years later. But I worked for this organization for a year and a half, and then I met Brian, and we got engaged at a very young age, and he was going to go to law school. We got married in May, and then he went to law school the following August. And he lasted for 2 weeks before he realized that it was not for him. He absolutely did not connect with the material, the people, like the whole vibe of the place. It was a confusing time for him, but it felt like the wrong decision. So we were kind of in limbo for a while and unsure. He was unsure of what he wanted to do professionally as a career. And lo and behold, we were recruited back into the ministry that I had just finished working for. It was a win-win. They could get him on staff and me with one person's salary. We could raise his salary with my financial backers that I'd already had and connected with. So we did it. We were excited about the opportunity, and we ended up moving to a small college campus in Alabama again. And we worked there for about 2 years. We had our first child at this point. Brian did not love the campus work. Again, we loved the students, loved the people, but he was like, with the pressure to like go have conversations with kids he didn't know and just to constantly be like so outgoing and gregarious about it all. He eventually ended up coming to work for a church, a large Presbyterian church in Birmingham, Alabama. He ended up being the college pastor at this church. Our college ministry there had hundreds of students in it. This church was massive. It was a mega church. It had buses in the parking lot to take you from your car to the church building. This is where we lived our next number of years together. We had 3 kids through these years. He would go early and set up his college program. It was basically like a small church within a big church. I'd be wheeling the stroller with all 3 of our kids up to this building. I was working to support him, working for free as his wife, loving these college students. I still, to this day, there's so many, every time I think about these students that were in our lives, they're our friends now. Like, I love all of them to this day. They were with us when we were like having our first kids. They were babysitting for us. They were like supporting us as a young family. It was a beautiful community time that we had there. And while we were there, the church paid for him to start going to seminary. And this really fueled Brian's fire. Like, he loved learning. He's a really naturally curious, intelligent man. And so getting to learn and dive deeper into theology was so wonderful for him. And I remember being there at this church, and we're starting to rumble and we're starting to question things. We were sitting in this massive Presbyterian church. It was a PCA denomination. And we're hearing like insular language, like us versus them. It was confusing. We're seeing like moments where there's just American flags like hung all the way up the huge long drive to get to the church because it was some sort of patriotic day. We're like, what? The pastor that we started there with changed guard. There was a new pastor that came in, and he would do Sunday night services on Civil War leaders. And we're like, what? You know, back then, this was like years and years and years ago. And we're like sitting there thinking, this doesn't feel like us. We're getting tired of the cultural assumptions in the South where everybody doesn't say, do you go to church or do you have faith? But they say, where do you go to church? So again, like we loved the people that we were with, but we were feeling rumblings. We were feeling discomfort. We were starting to question things. We were questioning things about the ministry that we had grown up in. We were questioning things about the church we were in. It wasn't pleasant. People weren't happy with questions during that time. But all of that to say is, as Brian developed and deepened his work in seminary, we realized we were at a place in our life where he could go to the physical campus. He was taking classes from a school in Florida, and we could spend his last year of seminary there as a family. So we packed up our things, sold our house. Abigail, our third child, was only 6 months old. We moved to Florida, lived off of the sale of our house for that 1 year while Brian was in classes full time to finish his degree. So at this time in our life, our faith had become more professional. Like it was like, this was our work. This was our job. This was something we did. And that feels, a lot of people would rather us say it was a calling, rather us say it was a mission. And that's fine if you want to use those languages, but it was our job. We finished seminary and we were looking for a job for Brian, and we got hired at a church in California. Our experience there lasted about 4 years. I think at this place, we had Elliot while we were there, our fourth child. And this place, I felt so supported as a family. I felt so cared for, so nurtured. We were living in the Bay Area, and there was just so much. The culture that we lived with in that time was so diverse. It was so fascinating to meet people from all different backgrounds, and it was highly educated. So many of the people I met there had multiple PhDs. I was moving there and terrified of being some sort of cultural assumption of like, here I am, this woman with 4 children, married to a minister and from Alabama. This is not gonna look good. But I remember the people there being naturally curious and open-minded. And it was such a breath of fresh air from the experience where I had like my walls kept feeling like they were getting closed in. My world was so, like, the people and the relationships I had all started to look the same. So we got to move to California and expand some of that, where so much of our faith was contracting in on itself. I was finally feeling some expansion, but there was still confusion about the way things were. I remember this church was trying to lean into women in leadership and trying to figure out how to thread needles of, here we are in a patriarchal denomination, but we also like highly value women leadership. How can we not get in trouble with the denomination, but still like elevate women? And so for me, I was like, okay, that feels right, but also wrong. Like, why is it so hard? We are in a very modern day. And so again, there was like just some rumbling happening within me of like, I love this place, and we're still so far from where I'd actually like to be as a person. But here I am, married to someone who is employed by this place. So it's very complex and it's layered. I think from working for churches for a lot of years, I always say churches are really big businesses without HR departments. And I stand by that because I've seen so much fallout from churches hiring and firing and like just no policies in place for like employment or behaviors or how to report people. Oh my God, don't even get me started on that when you're in a patriarchal system and there's no like way to report people. We all know, we've heard the stories of how really, really bad that can all get. But just on a personal level, like what I saw is like, wow, churches are businesses without HR. And we found ourselves kind of at the cusp of when there was a recession and there was so much going on. I think it was 2008. We ended up losing our job, and it was because the church finances weren't in the right place to sustain our salary and whatnot. So we ended up having to find a new job. And that is what got us up to Portland, Oregon. Brian took a new job at a church here in town, and moving here was complex. I was struggling with feeling like a fish out of water no matter where I was. I loved my life in California. I had really beautiful friendships. Our kids had so many friends. They were like running around in the neighborhood all the time, playing outside. And we moved to Portland, and I could not find my place. I was at our kids' environmental elementary school, which is as Portlandia as it can get when you think about the show of Portland. I love those people, but I felt so like I don't know how to belong here. And then I'd go to our church group and felt I'm not sure I know how to belong here either. I felt like faith became confrontational when I moved to Portland. It was so stark, the contrast between like outside the church and church. I thought nobody here goes to church to look good. It's the extreme opposite of the South, where it's like, if you go to church, you can explain yourself. Like, oh, really? I thought the only reason people go to church in Portland is because they absolutely want to be there. We found a lot of contrast in our congregation between people who I would say feel like the old guard, who are trying to protect theology and doctrine and retain black and white answers to really complex and layered questions. They are people that would fight you if you had any kind of curiosity or question anything that you said you believed. And then there was what I call like the refugees who would come to our church because they had grown up in a really conservative, extreme environment, and they were trying to figure out if they even still believed in anything. They were trying to heal. They were trying to ask questions. They were trying to process. And somehow in all those years that we worked there, we were trying to balance and thread those needles. But faith became really confrontational during those years to me. I felt like there was one conflict after the other that I was witnessing. For Brian, I felt very confined. And, even though there are some really, really beautiful people in that congregation that I did feel like allowed me space and freedom to be who I was, I felt very confined to support Brian and all the things he was going through. I didn't want to create any more fallout. As time went on in our little church in Portland, I started having more and more questions. I started questioning. I knew that I did not believe hell existed. I just thought, I can't ascribe to this idea. It just seems so ridiculous that this would be true. And then it made me wonder, what do I really even think about heaven? I started definitely questioning, how can I possibly say I'm an ally if I'm in this church that's kind of liberal, but still very conservative? I had questions because, people, my neighbors who were atheists were loving and supporting people in their community in the most profound ways, way more than Christians I knew were. I had questions that, if they say Jesus, you look at Jesus's life and how he loved the refugee, the Samaritan, the prostitute, and the way he'd respond to all these people, the least of these. And then I'm seeing Christians not do that at all. Christians standing on these moral issues and wanting people to know they're wrong. And it was just feeling so broken down in my mind. And I felt like, just as a family, wanting to support my husband and his job in this church, I was getting to where I was feeling really burnout and I needed a break. And I didn't take the freedom to take a break because I knew that if I took too much time off, that the fallout would land in his lap. People would ask him, he'd have to defend, he'd have to explain. And I just didn't want him to have one more thing to have to deal with. And then COVID hit. And our church, like many, went online. And so for the first time in my journey, I started thinking, oh, I actually have the freedom to show up or not show up as I'd like to. I would listen, I would turn it on. Sometimes I'd just practice yoga while I was listening. And I started questioning, like a lot of us, what place does church attendance have in our life? I think COVID shook everything up. The pandemic shook everything up, whether we go to work at the office or we work at home. Well, the same is true of churches and congregations. And I think a lot of people who had wanted to make moves or question things or maybe change their schedule or the way they did things started to. And that includes me. And I remember just feeling so strongly that I had been carrying this box that represented my faith. And in it was all the things that I said I believed. Like, this is the way that you have salvation. This is the way you should think about this. This is the way you answer that question. This is how we treat people. This is how we do this, how we spend our money, etc. And I had this box and it was all like so heavy and so neatly packed. And between the Trump presidency and how polarizing that was and how so many Christians supported this man that, says that he sexually assaults women online. That was like the first thing that came out that, he vocally admits doing this, and then Christians are like, yeah, he's our guy. And I'm like, I don't understand this box anymore. And then I already had questions, and then COVID hit and I felt like I just dropped it and it splattered on the sidewalk and it shattered into a million pieces. And I felt like I was standing just looking at the contents of the box, looking at the box shredded and in this pile, and just feeling like I'm not sure what I want to pick back up. And actually feeling like that's okay. Like, I don't have to know what I want to pick back up. And I think since then, I kind of just walked away from that box and its contents. And I feel like in my exploration, that faith finally feels like a freedom to me. I feel like I get to choose when I feel gratitude deep in my bones. I can express it however I want. I can express it to God. I can say Jesus. I can say whatever. Like, I can think of God as bigger than he's ever been in my mind. And I even can say as bigger than she's ever been in my mind. I can see like the role of women in faith communities in a different way. And I think about like the ease that I've been brought into personally in my journey of letting go of some of those black and white capital T truths that we used to say were non-negotiable. And I think about how little knowing of myself I had, how much self-denial I was in, how such little regard that I had as a human because of the way I ascribed, the way I thought of my faith. And now I feel it's such a paradox because I feel like I know myself in a deeper way. I trust myself in a deeper way. I feel like I'm able to give myself love and support in a way that I've never known how to. I feel so confident and at ease and comfortable. And I feel like faith is freedom. I feel like I don't know where my journey is going to end. And I don't feel like I have to know. I just am thankful for that freedom and knowing that I really will always believe that something bigger exists beyond us in this world, and how we define it and the words we use often are so similar, even when they sound different. And I love that. I love how unifying that feels and how connected that feels and how expansive that feels. This episode was brought to you by yours truly, Katie Prentiss. Produced and edited by the fabulous Lindsay Gensel.
Our incredible Sunshine Soul theme music was created by the one and only Adam Sweeney.
For more resources and transcripts, visit katieprentiss.com. That's Katie, Katie, Prentiss, Prentiss.com.